seen with these private. A lot of detention centers and prisons are private, or they're administered privately for the state.
Yep.
So there's money to be made.
Took in millions of dollars in bribes, and fortunately, after over 4,000 kids were sent to jail, some of them might have deserved it. Others of them definitely did not. Anyways, he's been sentenced. So there's some good news coming from that. But first, we've got to talk about it. We're still fighting 3 wars. A couple of them are really starting to...
Well, I guess it depends on how you define them. I mean,
okay.
You could define it even more broadly than that.
You could say, well, we're still occupying 130 countries.
Well, right. I mean, we still got occupational forces in Korea and Japan.
Sure.
And they cost money, but they're not really ongoing wars. So.
Yeah. And amazingly enough, I mean, you'd think by now... Obama ran on this what seemed like an anti-war platform years ago. And
if you listen carefully, he didn't really say.
But it sounded like it. Definitely sounded like it. It's amazing that we're still in these wars, and there's really no candidates except for the ones the media is marginalizing that would pull us out of these wars.
Well, that's because peace is just insane.
But
constant war is the only
isn't
rational.
That crazy? The public
policy.
support is not out there for wars or occupying 130 countries. The public doesn't need that. It's those.
But the government doesn't exist for the public, Tilly. It exists for very wealthy multinational corporations and politicians.
Short of Ron Paul, who's getting some media attention, and Gary Johnson, who's getting absolutely none of the Republican candidates are even talking about ending these wars. In fact, I've been watching the debates, and they're talking about doing whatever it takes to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons. Whatever it takes. That's talking about another war again. They're beating the war drum again.
Yeah, it's insane. And they keep bringing up this. That a lot of them won't even really make the point that Iran's a threat to the U.S. They'll just make the point that Iran's a threat to Israel. And I don't know when it was that the U.S. military became the military of another country. It doesn't seem like our problem. Yeah. That doesn't just go for that goes for any country. And we hear these justifications a lot. Well, they're a threat to allies in the region. It sounds like their problem.
Then you take out the calculator and you try to add up how much these wars cost, and the government doesn't even know. It's so many billions and trillions of dollars that they don't even have the real cost.
Yeah, the term close enough for government where it comes to mind. And the story I have here gets into that. And they're debating, they're saying Congress has allocated $1.3 trillion for war spending through fiscal year 2011. That's just for the Department of Defense, so that doesn't count things that might be somewhat related to a global war on terror, like Homeland Security spending or Justice Department spending, other spending that's related, to this effort to try to, supposedly go after Al-Qaeda, and then all the other things that fall under that umbrella. Certainly, they do go after actual terrorists. A lot of other people seem to have gotten swept up in some of these Department of Justice investigations and Department of Homeland Security investigations. But it's $1.3 trillion that they've allocated in special line item funding for the wars. However, they've spent, $5.2 trillion in a base budget because the Pentagon just gets their regular annual allocation of funding. We have no idea really accurate idea of, out of that, how much they've spent. The best estimate I see here puts the total spending, that $1.3 trillion plus some of their regular budget, because obviously they're spending some of that on Iraq and Afghanistan, puts the total at $3.7 trillion, or $12,000 per American.
I would also like to point out that if we weren't fighting all these wars of aggression in other countries, we didn't need to be spread to 130 plus countries out there, fight other dictators and other rulers who pose no real threat to the United States. The Pentagon wouldn't need its $5 trillion base budget. It wouldn't be necessary because we wouldn't need this giant standing army to go fight foreign wars.
Right, that's certainly true. Or to fight foreign wars, or certainly troops are kept in places like Japan, Germany, Korea for strategic reasons.
1,000 plus bases across the globe.
Right. I mean, one argument is, well, we keep them there to contain China, which probably doesn't do much to make China feel more at ease. But that's the idea, right? I mean, they're not just parking them there.
March across the ocean.
Right. I think it's rather silly myself, especially given our nuclear arsenal. I don't think the Chinese are going to be invading California or Hawaii anytime soon. A lot of things have changed since World War II, since Pearl Harbor. But on the other hand, I think part of what we do, especially when the U.S. puts troops in places like Western Europe, countries which are more than capable of defending themselves, partly they're using those air bases and things to get troops to other places. And partly we're effectively just as I mentioned Israel before, we're still subsidizing the defense of a lot of countries that aren't the United States. Your tax money, even though we've got all this debt piling up, the U.S. credit rating downgraded, our economic future looking pretty bleak, Washington, D.C. still sees fit to take your tax money and use it to effectively subsidize the defense of places like Germany, of Israel, of Japan. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, Toby. It's not just like they're overreacting and allocating way too many resources to defending the U.S. They're essentially trying to act as a military for a good portion of the world. Why don't we let, Germany and Israel and other countries that are supposed to be allies where we have bases, why don't we just let them worry about how they're going to defend their borders, and we'll worry about our borders?
Yeah. Meanwhile, these numbers, I want to get back to the numbers because they're so wishy-washy. It seems anywhere between $1 and $5 trillion being spent on these wars here.
Estimate, so.
How about the future costs of veteran affairs? All the thousands upon thousands of veterans coming back with blown off arms or psychological trauma.
Well, there's a direct, and not to mention, there's not only the human cost,
and then the cost in society of how many suicides are happening from veterans coming back.
You can't look at, it's not just the budget. You're right. It's not just the VA budget. It's also the fact that people who are wounded, whether they've got psychological damage that occurred or physical
costly
damage,
on society.
Right. They may never be able to have a job
Become
again.
alcoholics, drug addicts.
Not to mention the emotional toll. You can talk about the monetary toll.
Sure.
Then you can talk about the human cost.
And then that has a cost on their family, which has a ripple effect to all parts of society. This isn't only affecting the soldiers who are coming back. This is affecting all of society. And I know that for the most part, Americans have been isolated from these wars. It hasn't been since World War II, really. Vietnam to a certain extent when there was this a draft. But for the most part, Americans are isolated. There's no more rationing of supplies, going down and melting down any metal to make bullets and rifles. No, for the most part, Americans are isolated. But we're starting to see that we're not really, because those veterans come back and they are traumatized. They do have PTSD. A lot of them, it's difficult to be productive members of society. So there are human costs, there's societal costs, and then of course all this debt and financial costs.
Well, that's the thing I was going to get to, is that no, there's not rationing taking place today, but perhaps you'd almost be better off if there was. I'm not advocating that because it's not something I'd like to see. But what I'm saying is take a look at what this debt that's been incurred to fight these wars is going to mean. Take a look at what it's going to mean in terms of creating an unsustainable financial situation, perhaps leading to future downgrades of the U.S. credit rating, and what it's going to mean in terms of taxes and sacrifices, and basically the loss of all that capital from the productive economy. You're going to see something. It's a lot more hidden, so it's harder to pick up on the cost. Americans feel insulated from this war, Toby, but the cost there, that $3.7 trillion that I just mentioned, was $12,000 per American. Not to mention, it was money that was spent that the U.S. federal government did not have because they didn't bother to levy taxes to pay for the war, let alone ration rubber and metal and gas. So what they've done is they've taken the cost of this war and they've pushed it off, so we're really going to feel the full brunt of it in 15 or 20 years. And who knows how big the debt will be by the time the wars actually end. The expenditures in Iraq and Afghanistan are ongoing, and frankly, especially in Afghanistan, there's really no end in sight, at least based on what the politicians in power right now and the mainstream candidates are saying.
Right, and that $12,000 per American, that includes the little kids who weren't even born when the wars started.
Or the old people who are 95 who haven't paid taxes in 20 years and who are about to...
I don't think they're going to pay that money before they
No. They're on, pensioners on Social Security count towards that. That's per American. If you do it per taxpayer, it looks a lot worse.
Yeah. Okay, one thing you mentioned, Nick, was there's no candidates saying this, except mainstream. Well, is that true, though? Because by the time most people are watching this, it'll be a week since the Iowa straw poll took place. And you know what? I think it's kind of fitting that people are watching the show a week after it took place, because during that week, there has been a virtual media blackout on a candidate who was within just less than a percentage point from taking that poll away. Ron Paul was within 152 votes, less than 1% from winning the Iowa straw poll. But within the last week, you would never know that he was even running for president.
No, I mean, basically the coverage amounted to, Bachmann finished first. And this was here's the thing, is the media it's not like they're just discrediting the Ames straw poll and saying, straw polls don't matter, we're just not going to count it. They're being incredibly selective with their journalism here. And I don't see how, Bachmann was not necessarily, I mean, she's been a media darling, but she's not a huge force, she hasn't been to date, a huge force within the Republican Party. I don't know why it's so much more significant when Michelle Bachmann wins by less than 1% than when, say, Ron Paul had won. Would they just ignore that? If he had taken first, I think it would have been harder to do, but they basically just skip over him and say who finished first and second, and well, Ron Paul doesn't really matter, even though he finished basically in a statistical tie with Bachmann. And I'm not saying, straw polls are not accurate in the sense that they're not a scientific poll by any means, but they do say something significant about the amount of support and the amount of organizational ability that a campaign has. And Ron Paul has a huge amount of grassroots support and organizational ability. Finishing basically in the dead heat with Bachmann is something that's significant, but most news outlets have failed to cover that fact at all. They'll skip down to who finished third and fourth, but they don't cover who's in second place.
And Perry, who entered the race, they covered him more than anything.
And now Perry's a favorite?
Right.
I mean,
he's just another George
favorite?
Bush.
The media's favorite, apparently, because people in New Hampshire, maybe they've been following this because Perry's name has been floating around for a while and they've read up on him. People in New Hampshire have no idea who Rick Perry is. They've never seen him debate because he just entered the race. How is he their favorite? People in Iowa, no idea really who Rick Perry is because he hasn't really been campaigning, because he hasn't officially been in the race for more than a week. So how does he suddenly go, the guy who skips the straw poll and who people in most of the country outside of Texas really don't know at all when you're talking about your average voter, how does he go to being the favorite? And I hate to sound this way, Toby, but I really do feel like watching the last couple of election cycles, the media really tries to control, and tell you, these are the acceptable candidates. This is who you should vote for. Pick Mitt Romney or pick Rick Perry. I mean, how about you just report on things instead of trying to drive election cycles?
It's ridiculous. I've been watching.
Yeah, Fox News is so.
Well, all of them. It's not just Fox News.
No, it's
MSNBC.
everybody.
It's CNN. I was watching a couple of these
just
debates.
mainstream.
It's hard to watch these debates. I'm watching Ron Paul, the only candidate up there who's like, let's get out of these wars, and not only that, let's take the troops home from all around the globe. It's amazing. You don't hear any liberal Democrats, short of Dennis Kucinich, say that. You just don't hear it. That's not what candidates say, but you hear Ron Paul saying it. The crowd's applauding, cheering. Meanwhile, the moderators are rolling their eyes and laughing at him for suggesting that we bring the troops home from around the world and stop trying to be the police of the globe. And they're laughing at him. These are supposedly news people reporting the news, laughing at the idea of bringing troops home not only from Iraq and Afghanistan, getting out of Libya, but also Germany and Japan and the other 130 countries. He's the only candidate saying it, and he's getting laughed at by the news people for it. I watched this one clip on Fox News who said, Ron Paul's one of the candidates at the Iowa State Fair, but if you see him, don't talk to him. Just keep on going and see if you can get a Bachmann clip or a Sarah Palin clip, who's not even announced that she's running for president. They're saying, ignore him, and laughing about it. And this is supposed to be news? It's not. It's very sad to watch almost, because then you go, and then America goes, well, why do we get more of the same? Well, you've got another guy who's essentially George Bush III, Rick Perry, who the media is fawning over and completely marginalizing Ron Paul, the one guy who they say